In 330 BC, a man named Bessus held a knife to the throat of the Persian king. Darius III, ruler of the largest empire on earth, was bleeding in a wagon, stabbed by the men who were supposed to protect him. When Alexander arrived, he found the body still warm. He removed his own cloak and draped it over the dead king. Then he gave an order: find Bessus, not to negotiate, not to question. When they caught him, Bessus was stripped, chained, and paraded through the ranks. His nose and ears were cut off, a Persian punishment Alexander had adopted, and then he was sent to Ecbatana, where he was pulled apart. Now here's what's strange. At the time, Alexander's own men didn't question it. They understood it. Bessus had killed a king, and in Alexander's mind, that was a crime that couldn't be forgiven, because Alexander now considered himself that king's successor. But that logic carried something inside it that none of them noticed yet. Because if killing a king was the worst thing a man could do, then what did it mean when Alexander started treating himself as something more than a king? For 13 years, his army followed him across 3 continents. They crossed rivers that had no names on any Greek map. They fought in heat that killed horses standing still. They marched through a desert that would later claim more of their lives than any enemy army ever did. And for most of that time, they followed willingly, not because they were forced, not because they feared him, at least not in the beginning. They followed because Alexander did something almost no commander in the ancient world did. He fought in front of them. At Granicus, he charged first and nearly died in the opening minutes. At Issus, he drove straight toward Darius and didn't stop until the line broke. At Gaugamela, he rode so far ahead of his own cavalry that his officers lost sight of him. His men saw all of it, which is why what happened later is so difficult to explain, because the same men who loved him eventually refused to follow him. The same officers who charged beside him started dying at his hands. And the same army that conquered the known world broke apart, not because of an enemy, but because of him. So the question isn't whether Alexander was a great conqueror. The question is what happened, step by step, year by year, that turned the most loyal army in the ancient world into men who no longer recognized the person leading them. And that story doesn't begin on a battlefield. It begins with a gesture. Within a year, Alexander's own court historian would be in chains. The man who recorded his legacy, the nephew of Aristotle, would vanish without a trial. But that's not where this starts. It starts with Alexander sitting on a Persian throne, wearing Persian robes, while his own officers watched from the edges of the room. After Gaugamela, the Persian Empire didn't collapse all at once. It folded, city by city, province by province. Babylon opened its gates, Susa surrendered, Persepolis fell without a major fight, and when Alexander walked into the palaces that Darius had once occupied, he didn't burn them. Not at first. He held court there. He observed the protocols, and he paid close attention to one thing in particular: the way they treated their king. In Macedon, a king was first among equals. Generals spoke freely, the king drank with his men, and they called him by name. In Persia, the king sat above his court. Subjects prostrated themselves, face to the floor, arms extended, in a gesture called proskinesis. To Persians, it was etiquette. To Macedonians, you only prostrated yourself before a god. Alexander began wearing Persian clothing first. Then he adopted Persian court ritual. Then he began appointing Persian nobles to positions that had previously belonged only to Macedonians. Then, in 327 BC, he formally attempted to introduce proskinesis for everyone in his court, Macedonians included. Callisthenes, Alexander's own court historian, the nephew of Aristotle, refused. Not privately, not quietly. He refused in front of everyone. He said the gesture was appropriate for Persians, who had always done it, but that it crossed a line for Greeks and Macedonians, because it implied Alexander was claiming to be divine. Alexander dropped the requirement, but he didn't forget, and within a few months, Callisthenes would be arrested. The charge wasn't about proskynesis. It never was, officially. He was accused of involvement in a conspiracy, the so-called Pages conspiracy, which we'll come back to, but the timing was not lost on anyone. And the message travelled through the ranks without needing to be spoken. If the court historian, the man responsible for recording Alexander's legacy, could disappear after a public disagreement, then what exactly was the cost of saying the wrong thing? But what happened to Callisthenes was still months away. Before that, something else had to happen first, something that would change the atmosphere inside Alexander's inner circle permanently. A 60-year-old general was reading a letter. He thought it was from his son. His son was already dead. Before Parmenion finished the first line, the officers standing behind him drove their blades into his back. No trial, no assembly, no opportunity to speak. A man who had served the Macedonian crown for over 40 years was dead before he knew he'd been sentenced. This is how it happened. Parmenion wasn't just a general in Alexander's army. He was the general. He had served Philip II for decades, commanded the advance force that crossed into Asia before Alexander became king. At Gaugamela, he held the entire left wing, while Alexander led the right. His son, Philotas, commanded the companion cavalry, the most elite unit in the army. They were not outsiders, they were the foundation. So when a plot against Alexander's life was uncovered in late 330 BC, and Philotas was accused of knowing about it and failing to report it, the situation became something more than a legal proceeding. A man named Dimnus had organized a plot to assassinate Alexander. The conspiracy was reported through another chain. When investigators traced the information, they found Philotas had been told days earlier and hadn't said a word. Philotas was arrested, brought before the assembled Macedonian army, because under Macedonian custom, the army judged capital cases, not the king alone. He was tortured. The sources don't agree on every detail, but they agree he eventually confessed. He was executed by javelin in front of the army. Now you understand what Parmenion didn't know when that letter arrived in Ecbatana. His son was dead, and Alexander had already sent fast riders carrying sealed orders, not to Parmenion, but to his subordinate officers. The question wasn't whether the conspiracy was real. It might have been. Philotas might have known. The threat might have been genuine. The question was what happened afterward. A general who had never been accused of anything, who was not connected to the plot by any source, was killed without a hearing. And the reason was something no one wanted to say out loud. Parmenion controlled too many men, too many resources, and now had a reason to be angry. The calculation was strategic, not judicial. And once that distinction was visible, it couldn't be unseen. Within the year, another death would take place. This one with no strategy behind it at all. And it would happen in a room full of witnesses. To understand what happened at that banquet in Maracanda, you have to understand who Cleitus was. 3 years earlier, at the Battle of the Granicus, Alexander nearly died. A Persian commander swung a blade at his head. The blow split his helmet. Before the second strike could land, Cleitus cut the man's arm off. After that, Cleitus held a position of trust that went beyond rank. He was one of the old guard, tied to Philip's generation, the brother of Alexander's childhood nurse. By 328 BC, Cleitus had been appointed satrap of Bactria. But before he departed, there was a banquet in Maracanda, in what is now Samarkand. Wine was poured heavily. At some point, the younger officers began praising Alexander, comparing him to Heracles, to the gods. Then someone said his achievements had surpassed those of Philip. Cleitus stood up. He said Alexander owed his victories to the men who fought for him, that Philip's accomplishments had made everything possible, that Alexander was surrounded by flatterers. Officers tried to intervene. Cleitus was pulled away. He came back. And the second time, the exchange escalated further. According to Plutarch, Cleitus stretched out his hand and said, "This is the hand that saved you at the Granicus." Alexander grabbed a spear. Some sources say it was a javelin. Some say a sarissa, the long Macedonian pike, Either way, the weapon was in his hands before anyone could react. And in that room, full of officers, companions, guards, Alexander drove it through Cleitus. The room went silent. What followed is described in every major source. Alexander collapsed. He pulled the weapon from the body and turned it on himself. He had to be restrained. He retreated to his quarters for 3 days. Refused food, refused company. His advisors eventually convinced him to return to duty. The philosopher Anaxarchus told him that a king's actions were inherently just, that Alexander shouldn't be bound by ordinary rules of guilt. Alexander accepted that reasoning. No punishment was issued, no investigation was opened, and the officers who witnessed it drew their own conclusions, and yet within months, someone still tried to act. This is the conspiracy we mentioned earlier, the one that would reach Callisthenes. The royal pages were young Macedonian nobles who served the king directly, guarding his tent, handling his horse, attending him at meals. One of them was a young man named Hermolaus. During a hunt, Hermolaus killed a boar before Alexander had the chance to strike first, a violation of royal protocol. Alexander had him beaten publicly in front of the other pages. Hermolaus organized a plot. He recruited other pages who slept in rotation outside Alexander's tent. The plan was to kill Alexander during one of their guard shifts. The plot failed because Alexander didn't return to his tent that night. He stayed out drinking until dawn. The pages were arrested, tortured, and executed. But the investigation didn't stop with them. Callisthenes, the historian who had publicly refused proskynesis, was named. The sources disagree on what happened next. Ptolemy said Callisthenes was tortured and hanged. Aristobulus said he died of disease in chains. Plutarch reported he was kept in a cage and carried with the army for 7 months. What no source disputes, he was never given a trial, never allowed to defend himself. And the connection to proskynesis, the moment where he had openly challenged Alexander's authority, was impossible to separate from the charges. Whether he was guilty or not became irrelevant. What mattered was the pattern: public disagreement, followed by accusation, followed by disappearance. Philotas, Parmenion, Cleitus, Callisthenes. 4 men, all close, all gone. Not all in the same way, not all for the same reason, but all of them had one thing in common, and that was enough. By the time they reached India, there were no more voices willing to test it. But silence didn't mean acceptance. The campaign into India wasn't like anything that came before. In Persia, there had been clear targets, capitals to take, a king to pursue. India had no such clarity. The territory was vast, the kingdoms were fragmented. Every river crossed revealed another kingdom, another army, another ruler who had never heard of Alexander. At the Hyphasis River, Alexander faced King Porus and an army that included war elephants, animals the Macedonians had never encountered in serious combat. The battle was a victory, but it cost more than most. Infantry formations broke when the elephants pushed through the lines. Soldiers were trampled, gored, picked up by trunks and thrown. Alexander's own horse, Bucephalus, the animal he had ridden since he was a boy, died after the battle. Alexander founded a city in the horse's name, and then he gave the order to continue east. The men looked at the river ahead, the Hyphasis, and what lay beyond it. More kingdoms, more elephants, monsoon rains that had been falling without pause, rotting their equipment, turning the ground into mud that swallowed wagons whole. And for the first time